I was standing in the lobby of a midtown hotel last Tuesday, the kind of place where the marble is too cold and the ceilings are too high, waiting for an elevator that felt like it was taking an eternity to descend. When the doors finally slid open with that heavy, brassy thud, I stepped inside and did what everyone does. I looked at the panel. I watched my finger hover over the rows of illuminated plastic squares, and there it was. Or rather, there it wasn't. The sequence jumped from 12 to 14 without so much as a blink. We've all seen it. We've all accepted it as a quirk of the American psyche, a lingering bit of architectural folklore we tell ourselves is just about keeping the guests happy. We call it triskaidekaphobia. We blame it on a collective, irrational fear of a prime number, as if the billion-dollar real estate industry in New York City would actually sacrifice thousands of square feet of prime vertical space just because someone might feel a bit superstitious. But I've spent enough time in the municipal archives of Lower Manhattan to know that developers don't care about bad luck. They care about liability. They care about insurance premiums. And they care about keeping the city inspectors from padlocking the front doors. About 6 months ago, I was digging through a box of uncatalogued building permits from the mid-1920s, the era when Manhattan was aggressively clawing its way toward the clouds. I wasn't looking for ghosts. I was looking for the history of vertical transport, trying to understand how the Otis Elevator Company managed to convince a whole generation of people that being pulled up a shaft by a steel cable was safe. What I found instead was a series of frantic, handwritten amendments to the New York City Building Code, dated between 1922 and 1926. These weren't suggestions about aesthetics or guest comfort. They were mandates. The documents referred to something called Zone 13 resonance. At first, I assumed it was a structural engineering term, something to do with the way the wind hits a skyscraper at a certain height. But as I traced the paper trail through the Department of Buildings, the language started to shift. It became less about physics and more about containment. In the early 1920s, as the skyline began to spike, the city wasn't just building offices. It was building a new kind of human experience. People weren't used to living and working hundreds of feet above the pavement. The newspapers of the time called it High Altitude Vertigo. But the internal memos from the architects of the period told a much grimmer story. There were reports, dozens of them, from the very first buildings that dared to officially designate a 13th floor. It wasn't just that people were nervous. It was that they were getting lost. Not, I can't find the restroom lost, but a specific localized form of topographical amnesia. Tenants on the 13th floors of the early skyscrapers in the financial district would report stepping out of the elevator and being unable to recognize the hallway they had walked down every day for months. Maintenance crews would find office doors that didn't lead to offices, or stairwells that seemed to terminate in blank structural walls that weren't on the blueprints. The city tried to hush it up. They blamed the Prohibition-era spirits or the shoddy craftsmanship of the post-war boom. But by 1924, the situation had reached a breaking point. There was a specific incident at a hotel near Grand Central, a building that still stands today, though its records are notoriously difficult to access. According to a suppressed police report I managed to cross-reference, a night porter disappeared during a routine floor check on the 13th. They found his cart parked neatly in front of room 1308. The door was locked from the inside. When they finally took the hinges off, the room was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of furniture, empty of carpet, empty of windows. It was just a raw, concrete box that, according to the master plans, shouldn't have existed in that configuration. That was the turning point. The Real Estate Board of New York held a closed-door meeting in the winter of 1925. I found the minutes in a private collection. They didn't talk about superstition. They talked about the 13th floor anomaly as a physical defect of the city's grid. They realized that by naming the floor, by giving it a destination on a dial and a place in the mind of the public, they were somehow solidifying a space that the human brain, or perhaps the city itself, wasn't ready to handle. The solution wasn't to stop building. The solution was to lie. They realized that if they simply skipped the number, if they moved the sequence directly from 12 to 14, the resonance vanished. If you didn't give the elevator a button for the 13th floor, the elevator didn't stop there. And if the elevator didn't stop there, the space remained undesignated. It stayed in the realm of structural mass rather than inhabited space. The 13th floor became a ghost in the machine, a layer of the building that existed physically, but was bypassed by the consciousness of the people inside it. I looked at the elevator panel in that midtown hotel again. I realized I wasn't looking at a sign of superstition. I was looking at a safety valve. We think we're being clever, avoiding a bad luck number. But the architects of the 1920s knew the truth. They weren't trying to protect us from a curse. They were trying to make sure that when we pushed a button, we actually ended up in the same reality we started in. But here's the thing that kept me awake after I left the archives. If the 13th floor is still there, physically sandwiched between 12 and 14, but it has no door, no button, and no name, what is happening in that dark, unmapped slice of the building while we're all sleeping just 10 feet above or below it? I started looking into the blueprints of some of the oldest hotels in the city, comparing the exterior window counts to the interior floor buttons, and that's when I realized the discrepancy wasn't just a historical footnote. It was a current, ongoing calculation. I found a memo from a modern elevator maintenance firm, dated only 3 years ago. It was an instruction manual for Level 13 override procedures. It wasn't meant for the public. It was for the technicians who have to go into the shafts after midnight, the ones who hear the sounds coming from behind the walls where there shouldn't be any rooms. The question I had to ask myself was, if the city codes forced this change a century ago to keep us safe, why are the modern elevator companies still so terrified of what happens if the car accidentally stops at the gap? Should I continue with the next part? To understand why a city would collectively decide to lie to itself, you have to look at New York in the mid-1920s. It was a period of vertical fever. Architects were no longer just building shelters, they were competing for the heavens, racing to see who could scrape the clouds first. The steel skeletons of Manhattan were rising at a rate that defied logic, and for a few years, the rules of engineering seemed to be bending under the weight of sheer ambition. But as the buildings got taller, the reports coming out of the construction sites started getting stranger. I spent months digging through the archives of the Department of Buildings, looking for something other than the standard permit filings. I eventually found a series of internal memos from 1924, tucked into a folder labeled Structural Anomalies, Unresolved. These weren't reports of faulty rivets or weak concrete. They were accounts from foremen who couldn't explain why their measurements were failing. One specific entry from the construction of a luxury hotel near Grand Central caught my eye. The foreman, a man named Miller, wrote that his crew had finished the framing for the 13th level 3 times. Each morning, they would return to find the steel had shifted, or the floorboards were vibrating with a frequency that made the men nauseous. He didn't call it a curse. He called it spatial rejection. It was as if the city's grid, the very geometry of the island, was refusing to acknowledge that specific height. The city didn't stop the project. They couldn't. There was too much money at stake, too much pride. Instead, they brought in a group of consulting architects who weren't listed on the official blue ribbon boards. These were men who specialized in what they called the Great Omission. Their solution was elegant and terrifying. If the 13th floor was causing a rift in the psychological and physical stability of the tenants, the answer wasn't to remove the floor. You can't just skip a physical space in a 3-dimensional world. The answer was to re-index the reality of the building. They began a coordinated campaign to rebrand the 13th as a superstition. They fed stories to the newspapers about triskaidekaphobia, making it seem like a quaint old-world fear held by the uneducated. It was a brilliant piece of social engineering. By convincing the public that the number 13 was merely bad luck, they gave themselves permission to erase it from the buttons and the signage. But the physical space remained. In the 1920s, this was often referred to in private blueprints as the attic slice or the mechanical gap. On paper, these floors were designated for water tanks, elevator motors, or laundry services, places where the general public would never have a reason to go. But if you look at the architectural footprints of the hotels built between 1922 and 1929, the ceiling heights on the 12th and 14th floors are often suspiciously inconsistent. They were shaving inches off the living spaces to create a pressurized dead zone in between. I found a testimony from a retired elevator operator who worked at the Waldorf-Astoria in the late 30s. He told a story about a night when the power surged during a summer storm. The manual override kicked in and his car didn't stop at 12 or 14. It settled into the gap. He said the doors didn't open to a hallway. They opened to a space that looked like a hotel corridor, but the proportions were all wrong. The doors were too narrow. The lights didn't have a source. The air itself seemed to be glowing with a faint, gray static. He described a sound like distant, heavy breathing coming from the vents. He closed the doors and never spoke of it until he was on his deathbed, convinced that if he had stepped out, he would have walked into a version of New York that wasn't meant for people. The 1920s building codes were updated shortly after a string of disappearances that were scrubbed from the public record. Guests who checked into the 14th floor, which was technically the 13th, would occasionally report hearing footsteps directly above them, even when they were on the top floor. Or worse, they would complain that their room felt tilted, as if the building were leaning into a void. Architects began installing blind shafts, elevator paths that bypassed the 13th level entirely, encased in lead-lined concrete. They weren't just skipping a number, they were building a cage. They realized that by naming the floor, they were giving it a doorway. By unnaming it, they were attempting to starve the space of human attention, hoping that if no one acknowledged it, the spatial rejection Miller wrote about would eventually settle. But it didn't settle. It just became part of the infrastructure. If you walk into a vintage hotel in Midtown today, pay attention to the elevator's behavior between those two floors. There's often a slight increase in speed, a momentary flicker of the floor indicator, or a sudden drop in temperature. That's not just old machinery. That's the system working exactly as it was designed a century ago. It's the building holding its breath while it passes through the unmapped zone. I tracked down a retired city planner who had worked on the modern skyscraper renovations in the 80s. He told me that when they gut renovate these old buildings, they often find things in the gap that don't make sense. Furniture from the 20s that looks brand new, as if it was placed there yesterday. Tools that were left behind by Miller's crew, still sitting on workbenches in rooms that shouldn't exist. The most unsettling thing he told me wasn't about the objects, though. It was about the occupancy sensors. Modern fire safety systems require heat and motion sensors on every level. In many of these skipped floors, the sensors occasionally trip in the middle of the night. The security monitors show heat signatures moving through the dead space, human-shaped but moving with a fluidity that suggests they aren't hampered by walls or doors. We think we're being modern and rational when we laugh at the missing 13th floor. We think it's a relic of a more superstitious time. But the architects of the 20s weren't afraid of bad luck. They were afraid of the unassigned volume, the space that humanity wasn't supposed to occupy, but which we accidentally created when we reached too high. The renaming wasn't for our comfort. It was a containment strategy. By removing the button, they took away our permission to enter. They turned the 13th floor into a ghost in the machine, a slice of the city that exists only in the margins of the blueprints. And as long as the guests keep believing it's just a silly superstition, they stay in their rooms on the 14th floor, never realizing that the ceiling beneath their feet is the only thing separating them from a reality that has been waiting for a visitor since 1924. The question that keeps me looking at these buildings isn't why they skip the floor. It's what happens when the containment fails. What happens when the mechanical gap gets full? Because if those heat signatures on the sensors are real, then the 13th floor isn't empty. It's just waiting for the right person to press a button that shouldn't be there. I spent 3 nights in a midtown hotel that still uses the old 1920s floor plan logic. I brought a digital barometer and a simple thermal camera. I wanted to see if the mechanical gap was as silent as the management claimed. What I found wasn't a haunt, not in the traditional sense. It was a pressure differential. Every time the elevator passed the seam between 12 and 14, the air inside the car changed. It grew heavy, metallic, like the air before a lightning strike. This is what the 1924 inspectors were trying to mitigate. They realized that by stacking human activity, hundreds of people living, breathing, and dreaming, so high in the air, they were creating a massive field of biological energy. And that energy needed a place to bleed off. The 13th floor was designed as a lightning rod for the soul. In the archived reports of the New York Bureau of Buildings, there's a recurring term that vanished by 1930, the Interstitial Clause. It was a legal loophole that allowed developers to build one floor that didn't officially exist for tax purposes, provided it remained unoccupied by living persons. The city got its skyscrapers and the architects got their bleed-off zone. But the problem with creating a space for nothing is that something eventually moves in. By 1928, the report stopped being about tax codes and started being about anomalous occupancy. Elevator operators, the men who actually had to manually lever those cars through the shafts, began refusing the night shift. They claimed the cars would stop on 13 on their own, the doors sliding open to reveal a floor that was finished, carpeted, and lit, but entirely devoid of doors. Just a hallway that went in a circle, with no way out but the shaft. There is one specific case that stands out in the 1929 precinct logs. A guest at a prestigious hotel on Fifth Avenue reported a scratching sound coming from his floor. He was on the 14th. He told the night manager it sounded like someone was trying to climb through the carpet. When the maintenance crew went to the floor below, the 12th, they found the ceiling perfectly intact. There was no space for a man to stand, let alone scratch at the floorboards. It was only when they consulted the original 1923 blueprints that they realized there was a 6-foot void between the two levels. A void that wasn't on the elevator panel. A void that, according to the night manager's private diary, had been accidentally triggered by a power surge during a summer storm. They never found the source of the noise, but the guest checked out an hour later, leaving his luggage behind. He told the doorman he wasn't staying in a building that had extra heartbeats. We like to think our modern sensors and smart elevators have solved this. We assume that because the software doesn't show a 13th floor, the hardware doesn't either. But the physical shaft doesn't care about your software. The elevator still has to travel through that space. It still has to pass through the unassigned volume. And every time it does, it acts like a piston, pushing the air and whatever else is caught in that gap up and down the building. That's why you feel that sudden pop in your ears that doesn't quite match the altitude. That's why the lights flicker for a fraction of a second when you pass the middle of the building. It's not a mechanical glitch. It's the elevator car momentarily brushing against the reality we tried to rename out of existence. The 1920s architects weren't just builders. Many of them were obsessed with the geometry of the city. They saw Manhattan as a giant circuit board. They knew that if you build high enough, you start to interfere with things we don't fully understand. The skipped floor was their way of grounding the circuit. It was a buffer zone between the earth and the sky. A place where the static of human existence could settle. But static builds up, and eventually, a spark jumps. I've seen the modern maintenance logs for some of the oldest skyscrapers in Chicago and New York. They are littered with phantom calls, elevators being summoned to floors that don't have buttons, security alarms being triggered in zones that aren't on the map. The technicians call them ghost signals, but I think they know better. They know that the 13th floor is still there and it's getting crowded. The most chilling detail I found wasn't in a government report, but in a letter from a retired architect to his son in 1945. He wrote that they didn't stop at 13 because of bad luck. They stopped because they realized that the more people you put in a building, the more weight the 13th floor acquired. He described it as a collection plate for things that don't belong to us. He warned his son never to stay in a room directly above the gap because the ceiling is thinner than the floor. He was talking about the 14th floor. He was talking about the room you probably booked for your next vacation. We think we're safe because we can't see the number on the wall, but the number is just a label. The space is real. The volume is there. and it has been collecting the static of every guest who has stayed in that building for a century. I don't think the 13th floor is a place you go when you die. I think it's a place that exists alongside us, a shadow twin of our own world that we accidentally built out of steel and limestone. The 1920s codes were the first attempt to manage that shadow, to box it in and keep it away from the paying customers. But boxes break, and as the buildings get older, the Interstitial Clause becomes harder to enforce. The heat signatures on the sensors aren't ghosts. They are the residents of the unassigned volume, and they've been living in the margins of our blueprints for a long time. They don't need a button to call the elevator. They just need us to keep pretending they don't exist. The next time you're in a hotel and you see that jump from 12 to 14, don't smile at the old superstition. Look at the gap between the doors when the car moves. Listen to the change in the hum of the cables. You aren't avoiding bad luck. You are participating in a century-old conspiracy of silence. You are standing on top of a mechanical gap that was never meant to be empty, and you're hoping that the architects of 1924 were as good at containment as they were at construction. Because if that containment fails, the 13th floor won't be a missing number anymore. It will be the only floor the elevator knows how to find. We have spent 100 years trying to engineer our way out of the dark, but all we've done is build the dark into the walls. We renamed the floor to keep people inside, to keep the economy moving, and to keep the fear at bay. But the fear doesn't care about the name on the door. It only cares about the space it's been given. And in the heart of every great city, in every grand old hotel, there is a space that doesn't belong to the city, the hotel, or you. It belongs to the 13th floor, and it's been waiting for a long time for someone to stop pretending. Check your room number tonight. If you're on the 14th floor, take a moment to press your ear to the carpet. Listen for the scratching. Listen for the heartbeat that doesn't match your own. And remember that just because you didn't press the button doesn't mean you didn't arrive. The file on the 13th floor isn't closed, it's just hidden in the unassigned volume of our history. That's the end.